Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Ed Arnold, and I am the Senior Research Fellow for European Security here at the Institute. And also welcome to the third London meeting of our Transatlantic Trilateral Security Dialogue project, alongside the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI in Oslo, and the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, in Washington, which is now in its third year, generously sponsored by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We have a full house here at RUSI today and also online, and by my calculation, it's almost a 300% increase on the event that we did here last October. So it's almost like something recently has happened, which was entirely predictable and Europeans don't feel fully prepared for. And when we planned this session back in DC in April, we chose this week as we thought that we'd know a little bit more about the transition and how that was shaping up, so we'd have something interesting to say. We had Thanksgiving as a backstop because Max wouldn't travel the following week. We also decided on 90 minutes, so we were able to get down to the detail required and hit the topic from a few different angles, because obviously there is a lot to talk about. Not quite perfectly timed because the UK Secretary of State for Defence is in front of the Defence Committee in Parliament at 10:30, but almost perfectly timed. In terms of the format and housekeeping, the whole event is all on the record and it is being recorded. Please turn your phones to silent, and there is no planned fire alarm. If there is one that goes off, please follow the directions of the RUSI staff. And for those of us joining online, when we get to the Q&A, please use the Q&A function on Zoom, not chat. So pleased to introduce the panel of experts that we have today. So first, to deal with the closest crocodile to the canoe, which is support to Ukraine, pleased to introduce Mariia Zolkina. She's a Ukrainian researcher and public policy analyst, and currently head of regional security and conflict studies at the Ukrainian think tank Ilko Democratic Initiatives Foundation. In 2022, she was invited by LSE to contribute to her expertise on Russia's war in Ukraine, security issues and conflict settlement options. Since 2014, she's been producing expertise on the socio-political component of the Russia-Ukrainian war, especially in terms of the Donbass region. Also served as external consultant to the Ministry of Informational Policy of Ukraine and the Government Office for European and Euro-Atlantic Integration of Ukraine. Next, to provide some analysis of the transition and what is happening in DC and hopefully some salacious gossip from the Hill, Max Bergmann. He's the Director of Europe, Russia and Eurasia Programme at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies and our long-standing partner on this project. Prior to joining CSIS, he was a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, focusing on Europe, and from 2011 to 2017, he served in the US Department of State in a variety of positions, one of which that I did not know previously as a speechwriter to then Secretary of State John Kerry. Then to continue the DC salacious gossip, we're very pleased to have Jim Townsend, who's going to cover what's happening over there, a little bit on Europe, but without stealing Oana's sandwiches. Today you've got a purple hat on, so as RUSI Senior Associate Fellow and not your current position of Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Center for New American Security, CNAS, because there was a little bit of an issue over dinner yesterday, and that's why I'm in the middle of you now. He's a co-host of the Brussels Sprouts podcast, a weekly interview program featuring leaders in the transatlantic defense community, also a senior advisor at the Atlantic Council, and teaches a course on transatlantic security at Sciences Po in Paris. By 2017, Jim had completed 8 years as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO policy, capping 34 years of working in defense and foreign policy, particularly on NATO and Europe. So there's really no one better to talk about the topic. And then finally, to talk about the impact on NATO of the US presidential election, we have Oana Lungescu, who we're very privileged to have as a distinguished fellow here at RUSI. She's the former longest-serving NATO spokesman, that she held the position from 2010 to 20... Say again? Spokeswoman, sorry. But the first woman and first journalist to hold the post. She directed the Alliance Communications during the most turbulent period in a generation, providing strategic advice to two Secretaries General, Jens Stoltenberg and Anders Fogh Rasmussen. And you've actually been popping back up on my Twitter feed because the meeting between President Trump and then Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has reappeared, and you are actually at the edge of the table, and you are opposite then Chief of Staff John Kerry.
Was looking at the ceiling most of the time, yeah. That was the famous breakfast meeting before the 2018 summit in Brussels.
So when you were there, you were the official responsible for NATO's public messaging and chief speechwriter, played a critical role in NATO's approach to Russia and China, the accession of Finland and Sweden to the alliance, and operations from the Western Balkans to Afghanistan and Libya. You were awarded the NATO Meritorious Service Medal in 2023, and also in 2016, Politico named you as one of the most influential women in Brussels.
A very long time ago.
So we'll get on with the pre-prepared comments and then move into Q&A straight after. So please, Mariia, floor is yours.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ed, and good morning to everyone. Thanks, RUSI, for organizing this extremely timely event, because all last weeks before elections and after elections, we have been speaking a lot about basically what are the challenges and threats and ideas which comes to experts and politicians' mind about possible consequences for Ukraine and for the large-scale war Russia is waging on Ukraine after Trump will start, in fact, his first term. Speaking from Ukrainian perspective, I would say that before the elections, the expectations from possible consequences of Trump re-election were much calmer in Ukraine than in the West. Probably this is because Ukraine has understood that the policy and approach implemented by the previous administration, still administration, Biden administration, was not effective to the extent to make Ukraine win the war, but rather to survive. And probably because of that, the fears and any kind of negative expectations from unpredictability of Trump or his idea to find any kind of solution in a way that no one can predict, those expectations were not that much threatening Ukraine's political and social mind inside the country, and rather Ukraine was preparing for both scenarios. After the elections, so I have to admit that the discussions about what will happen to Ukraine, they have just speed up, they have skyrocketed. First and foremost, because of two questions. The first one is what's about long-lasting military support to Ukraine? Because unfortunately, Ukraine has won for all its partners and for European partners in particular almost 3 years of the war in terms of giving the time to prepare the defense and military industries and domains to get prepared for possible consequences in case Russia conventionally or hybridly someone will try to undermine the security of the European continent, or to prepare for the situation which is pretty possible right now, that US will step away from being the main military donor of Ukraine. This, of course, is a big challenge because Europe generally is not prepared to take this role yet. However, is pretty frightened by the fact that they will have to do something because the Russia's pushes on Ukraine, and in case Ukraine falls down or the front line is collapsed, so the first who will feel this effect will not be US, will be European countries, European neighbors of Ukraine. The second issue, which is make Ukrainian discussion about possible consequences of Trump election, is of course negotiations. I can't say so. Ed has mentioned that since 2014, I'm dealing with wartime diplomacy and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in particular in Donbass, and I understand pretty well that the logic of Russia right now, and with this enormous increase of the warfare, especially air attacks, and not only air attacks, but pushes underground in Donbass in particular, and in Zaporizhia region, this is really the preparation of Russia for negotiations. This is the best evidence to me because this is the long-lasting tactics and strategy of Russia to increase the pushes underground in order to corner basically your vis-a-vis to be weaker and to corner your vis-a-vis to sit down at the table. Couple of words from Ukrainian perspective here. This is not a piece of news that Ukraine will be asked to think a lot about possibly negotiated deal with Russia. This discussions publicly and unpublicly, they are circulating for at least 1 year, since our partners in the West were more than even Ukraine dissatisfied with very modest results of 2023 counteroffensive of Ukraine. And the consequence, the direct political consequence last year was to start thinking about what's about the possible deal. However, the problem is that Ukraine needs and wants, not only just from its own perspective, but from European or regional security perspective, wants some guarantees that this deal will bring predictability and sustainability of at least, even not peace, but at least ceasefire. If this ceasefire is just a political declaration without any guarantees, any monitoring mission, any boots on the ground, not even along the front line, but for instance, at least along the northern and northeast border of Ukraine with Belarus and Russia, where Ukraine is still keeping enormous number of Ukrainian soldiers who cannot just leave this line in order to support their compatriots on the real front line inside the country. So if we don't have all these conditions, then the ceasefire will be no more than a game. Ukraine will be dragged into, the direct consequence of which most probably will be significant decrease of Western help, because the logic of Western partners of Ukraine, in contrary to Russia, and this is one of the main challenges for Ukraine now, if we're starting negotiations about anything, we start doing anything that can potentially provoke so-called escalation. While Russia, when start negotiations or preparing to negotiations, doing completely the opposite. They're doubling down on their military production, they're doubling down on their warfare activity on the ground, and we already see this disbalance on the ground. And I'm afraid that we are not yet at the moment when US, under Trump, and unfortunately Ukraine, influenced or impacted by Trump re-election, will be in a strong position during these negotiations. However, there is no expectations that huge political deal will be in place. So that's why Ukraine, while understanding all these challenges, has done very wise step recently. And in my opinion, will be doing this even more actively. Ukraine is extremely actively trying to increase local military production, which is of vital importance. And you can see it even from official, open information, what even to say about non-public discussions about that Ukraine is not asking for that much delivery of military aid to Ukraine now, rather than is asking recently for helping to increase local production, to set up new local enterprises, to invest, and of course to secure Ukraine with air defense, because no local production, even in the very west of Ukraine, is possible without good air defense. For instance, today there is another piece of news from Ukraine that for the first time Russia supposedly has striken intercontinental ballistic missile on Ukraine, with not nuclear warhead, with a conventional warhead, but still this is another sign that here Ukraine needs not keeping the same level of military aid, especially air defense missiles to be delivered to Ukraine, but even increase of that. This can partially substitute the lack or potential lack of other types of the weapons being sent to Ukraine after Trump in the office. And the last but not least here is about the connection between these, let's say, attempts of Trump supposedly to set up some kind of a deal, most probably just about the ceasefire, nothing else, and domestic situation in Ukraine. President Zelensky, from political and maybe from personal perspective, won't be able to sign anything or even to declare anything stating that Ukraine actually agrees to de facto situation when part of the Ukrainian territory is occupied. This is not possible at all. The second important point here is President Zelensky and no one in power now in Ukraine won't be able to agree that Ukraine will refrain from its EU or NATO membership aspirations, partially because of huge demand from inside the country to receive this not membership perspective, but membership itself, both in European Union and NATO, but also because this will prove that Ukraine's rights for political sovereign decisions are being impacted by negotiations between US and Russia, and politically this is not bearable for President Zelensky. He will not do that. And the third point here, direct negotiations are hardly possible between Ukraine and Russia. That's why I do see the space probably with indirect negotiations stating some kind of declaration about possible ceasefire, but without direct signing of the documents. We have had already a very close example of that, like back in 2022 with grain deal. Then we have another track of negotiations about returning to Ukraine deported kids with the mediation of Qatar. And we have had another track which unfortunately has failed so far about refraining from strikes on energy infrastructure both inside Ukraine and Russia. These negotiations have failed, but these are just the schemes, the only one format which is possible at this very moment, in my opinion. The problem for Ukraine with the Trump is that there is an expectation that as soon as, let's imagine, Trump forces or enforces this kind of deal about possible ceasefire or temporary ceasefire, Trump will get disinterested in Ukraine and Russia's war the very next second, and then the real problem will appear for Ukraine. Politically, it means that Ukraine will not be on an agenda for new administration, and they will divert their attention from Ukraine to some other regions, including Middle East. The military aid will drop again, even to a greater extent than we expect now. For this reason, I do think we have a huge challenge, even if Trump will succeed with supposedly his initiative about ceasefire. But speaking practically on the basis of my analysis of Russia waging war on Ukraine hybridly or conventionally since 2014, I do not see, unfortunately, any evidence for the ceasefire, even if there is a declaration about that, to be sustainable. I do think Russia is trying to start this game right now exactly to step into the negotiations before the position of Russia is weaker than it is now. They want to do it in advance. To have a huge gap between the capacities of Ukraine while negotiations are being held and the capacities of Russia, which are stronger at this very moment. And then in, 3 to 6 months, possibly 1 year, which will be the pause favorable for Russia domestic restoration of its capacities, Russia will try to attack again. So we are not speaking about not only a political deal, we're not speaking about any perspective of the end of this war, unfortunately. Even with Trump being, for a short-term perspective, very interested in getting some kind of success here.
Thank you very much. So, yes, how is, moving on to Max, how is the Trump administration shaping up based on his nominees this far, and what does that mean for Ukraine and European security?
Well, if I had gone back in September and said that Donald Trump was going to nominate a congressional bomb thrower like Matt Gaetz to be head of the Department of Justice, that he was going to nominate a Fox News host to be Secretary of Defense, a brief acting Attorney General to be his ambassador to NATO, who has no experience, and then Tulsi Gabbard to be Director of National Intelligence, and RFK Jr. to be HHS Secretary and Secretary of our Health Department. I think you would have said, you're just a liberal sort of radical that is just a doomer about Donald Trump and are extremely pessimistic. So in many respects, the nominations are what you would have expected in a second Trump term, where the dial is turned up. And I think it is time to sort of take Trump very seriously about what he has indicated that he wants to do. We oftentimes have had lots of discussions about what Xi Jinping's intentions were with Taiwan, and there was a common refrain, well, you should read what he says and take him literally. And I think that's true with Trump, and I think the way that applies to European security and to Ukraine and to Russia is that he wants to fundamentally change US policy. And I think when it comes to NATO, that means basically a major paradigm shift and post-World War II US engagement in Europe. And Trump had that inclination in the first term. And I hear Europeans a lot come and say, well, you know, the first term, we dealt with him, we can make deals, you know, there's ways to work around him. I think it's just such a different setting. I was in the State Department on the policy planning staff in 2016, and the policy planning staff oftentimes is sort of front and center when it comes to a transition. And you know, you write all these memos for the incoming administration, and there was no meetings. There was almost no transition. Secretary of State John Kerry never actually met with the incoming Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and just left a bunch of memos on his desk as he walked out the door on January 19th. And because the transition was utterly chaotic, because Trump didn't think he was going to win. This time, we're seeing a much more, a much faster transition. It's much more well crafted. And you also are not having what you had in the first term, are the quote unquote adults in the room, people like Secretary of Defense General Mattis, who served in countless administrations as a military officer, could have served in a Democratic administration in a political appointed position, and deeply committed to NATO, serving as a check, where then if you worked at the Department of Defense and Donald Trump said something negative about NATO, and then no one sort of followed up with you to enforce or to begin to implement any sort of actions vis-a-vis NATO, you didn't do it. And so when Trump ordered US forces out of Germany, Secretary of Defense Mark Esper didn't do it. He, delivered commander's intent, maybe moved some kitchen staff out or around, but didn't actually follow through on that order. And that's just not how this administration is going to work. You're going to have a Secretary of Defense, an ambassador at NATO, that are in those positions because they will do what Trump says, and that's what Trump wants. And frankly, that's how administrations are supposed to work. And then you compound it with the administration feeling that during the first term that they were thwarted at every step by the so-called deep state. And at times, this wasn't totally wrong, where you had career officials sort of given vague direction, and that was counter to kind of decades of U.S. foreign policy, or U.S. policy or U.S. law in certain cases, and just saying they're not going to do that, and sort of waiting out the first term, and the Trump folks felt thwarted, and now they are looking to really threaten a lot of the career civil service. There's this various provision which would enable them to potentially just fire civil servants at will. So I think we're going to see a lot of people, career people, people who've been there for a long time, retire. That can leave, and then others that are going to be more compliant because their jobs are going to be dependent on it. We'll see if Elon Musk is able to, implement government efficiency and fire lots of people. My experience with the U.S. government is that there aren't enough people in lots of positions, particularly if you look at things like sanctions enforcement and other areas like that. So I think it's still going to be a chaotic administration. There's still going to be knives out. Reporters are going to do very well in getting lots of scoops. But I think when it comes to European security, what we're going to begin to see is an administration that has also spent, administration that is coming into power, having spent 4 years, thinking about how to implement Trump's vision for the world. So how do you take kind of Trump's broader kind of antipathy toward NATO, toward European security, toward allies, and begin to sort of execute that as a vision? And you've seen some rather thoughtful pieces about how you would begin to sort of pull the US back from NATO. And this gets at the fundamental desire, I think, on the part of Trump world, which is to shift responsibility for European security to Europeans. In some ways, that's quite reasonable. Europe is a wealthy continent. It's fairly rich. And there is a sense that the United States needs to be focused on its preoccupation, which is China. So I think there's going to be a real effort to shock Europe, to say the business as usual is not there. So what does that mean? I think we could see a situation where the US goes to NATO and says, you know how you've done all these plans that assume that you're going to have all these US capabilities? Well, those aren't there anymore. Those are going to the Indo-Pacific. Maybe we'll reduce US force presence. Yes, we're going to jump up and down and shout about spending more, but ultimately, we're not going to care that much, and we're just going to begin to, I think, pull back. That is what my kind of expectation would be, and I hope I'm wrong, and I hope countries like Poland and the UK could come and, you know, strike a deal or slap Trump on the back, and then nothing really happens. But I think what's different is that you have people that are actually determined now, I think, to begin to execute that change. And while people took a lot of comfort with people like Marco Rubio, and I think Marco Rubio will be confirmed as Secretary of State, and I think is a very solid choice. You can see him in any administration. You know, Marco Rubio voted against Ukraine funding when it came up in April for reasons that basically meant that he wanted to align with Donald Trump. And so maybe to quickly comment on Ukraine, you know, we saw this in the first term where Donald Trump will try to go around and, you know, win a Nobel Peace Prize and try to go to North Korea and negotiate peace, and then it was Kosovo. But the question I would ask is, who does Russia in Trump world? Who is the Russia expert? I don't know them. In the first term, we had Fiona Hill. But Fiona Hill wasn't, someone who was an actual Russia hand that was then brought into the administration by H.R. McMaster, not associated with Trump. And you don't have deep thinking about Russia or a lot of focus on Russia and Ukraine. And so this notion that the United States can sort of snap its fingers and bring Vladimir Putin to the table, I mean, I think we have leverage with Ukraine, and we could say you must negotiate. Ukraine would, I think, come to the table. But with Russia, I mean, we've just seen the United States' lack of leverage in the Middle East over the last year. So this idea that Donald Trump will snap his fingers, Russia will stop fighting, and the war will sort of be resolved is completely fanciful. And so who, if you are going to then have really intense negotiations, who's the Richard Holbrooke that is going to be empowered by the president, that is going to spend a ton of time on this? And there's a reason why no one wants to focus on Russia in Trump's world. It's because, Trump has this, affinity for Vladimir Putin, and we've seen it in his first term. So I think the big challenge, though, is that when we talk about US funding for Ukraine, which I think is absolutely the most fundamental issue, the problem is that this isn't up to the president. Congress has to pass the money. So the Biden administration is now working very hard to spend down all the money that was passed last April. So a new Trump administration is going to have to come in and ask Congress for tens of billions of dollars. And the big question for Ukraine is, will Trump actively make that ask? This is not something that will just sort of like keep on running. The trains don't, we saw this last year where Congress didn't pass the funding, and what happened is the amount of weapons that the US could provide Ukraine, despite the Biden administration wanting to provide weapons, couldn't do it because you can't do anything without Congress allocating the funding. And the secret of US foreign policy has been Congress has usually just written the check for what we've wanted to do. And last year, that broke. It's only really Vietnam in 1975 was the only real other example I can think of that we saw something similar. But what happens if the president doesn't make that request? So Trump has to actively ask for funding for Ukraine that he has publicly disparaged on the campaign trail for the last year. And his son has gone on Twitter or whatever social media platform and said that that's going to stop. So I think what Europe needs to recognize here is that this is not going to be the kind of business as usual, but an American president just yelling at them a bit more and being a little bit more impolite than a Democratic administration. And this is, I think, going to be a real change in US foreign policy toward Europe. And then the question is, what does Europe do about that, and how does Europe respond? And I'll leave it there.
How does Europe respond, Jim? Are you more optimistic or more pessimistic than Max?
Well, I've tried to make up my mind where I was, optimistic or pessimistic. I was, as Max was talking, kept shifting back and forth between depression and just, passing it off to Oana and just forget about it, or try to look for silver linings. We'll see where I am by the time my little piece is done. But I do appear with a great sense of being humble because Max was talking about his experience at the State Department when Trump was elected the first time. And when Trump was elected in 2016, 2017, I left as a political appointee as well as Max. But I remember telling my office and a lot of European officials who came through asking this question, I said, look, this is going to be something where we see the president going to the center. This always happens. A president newly elected comes in and has to deal with the world as it is, and whatever they might have said on the campaign trail, they're going to have to move to the center. And I think with Trump, he'll depend on a lot of experts that he'll bring in from the Republican Party, maybe even some Democrats. So I was spinning this story to my office, which was in tears the day after the election. This is in the Pentagon, okay? In tears, and I was saying, it's okay, we're going to be fine. Well, I was really wrong. And so I sit before you now, 4 years later, and I'm not going to say things are going to be fine, stop crying, Max, stop crying. We're going to make it. So I'm very humble here, and to say also, as Max was talking, I was thinking, we've become kind of criminologists from the old Cold War days, where we're studying Trump and what he said on the campaign trail and what he did 4 years ago, trying to figure out where he's going to be, just based on these fragments of things that we've picked up. And, we could be absolutely wrong. So I sit here, and I'm sure you're saying, why did we even invite this guy if he's just going to spend, all this non-information? But so as I look at it now, Trump is going to come into a world that's different than the one he left back when Biden came in. NATO is different. Europe is different. The United States is different, too, a bit. I mean, he is going to come in with this mandate, and this depends on how you define mandate, but in Trump's mind, he's got a big blank check written by the American people to take forward what he said on the campaign trail. So he's going to come in feeling very strong and has the statistics to, at least as they stand today, the statistics to point out that it was a pretty heavy vote. But, the Europe that he's going to be dealing with is different. It's a Europe at war, and that point isn't well understood in the U.S., certainly even in Washington, what Europe is going through, particularly those that border Russia. The cutting of the cables a couple of days ago that has been happening, unfortunately, with more frequency than you would think, is something that for us was a real alarm, but I'm sure across the United States you didn't have people as alarmed as certainly we are. So he's going to come in and if he won't be reading his briefing papers, as Max pointed out, and he won't be coming in thinking about Europe and NATO when he wakes up in the morning after his inauguration. That's not going to be top of his to-do list. He's laid out a lot of things he's going to do in that first day. Remember, he said he was going to be a dictator in that first day, but only for one day, he said. But it's not going to be to pull us out of NATO. It's not going to be doing something against Europe. It's all going to be focused on these domestic issues that really has energized not just his base, but a lot of the American people too, dealing with the border or dealing with the economy and inflation. He's going to do some things that are going to be photogenic. They're going to be capturing with a lot of American flags in the background. This is going to be capturing the mood of the country that he feels he was able to tap into to be elected. So he won't be talking about moving out of NATO and this type of thing. But I will say this morning, when I looked on Twitter, the announcement about the U.S. perm rep to NATO, and Max alluded to him a little bit. He was the former Attorney General. There's various views about whether how he might do or not do based on what we know. But the thing that struck me, though, was Trump tweeted this and said, in a relative sense, said positive things about NATO. He didn't say my perm rep's going to turn out the lights and is going to pull us out. The fact that Trump even put forward a perm rep at NATO was shocking to me, because I felt that one of the things he might do to show displeasure with NATO was not to have a perm rep, not to have an ambassador there, but to just have the Foreign Service, run things at the deputy level. But no, he was quick, in a relative sense, to put forward Whitaker, this former Attorney General. And said some things like he's going to help keep NATO strong and this type of thing, and I was pretty shocked. So that's a little bit of a silver lining, that maybe that he didn't pull us out of NATO from day one and put forward a perm rep. But he's going to have to deal with this different NATO and this different Europe, and he's going to have to learn this, I think, when he meets with European officials. When he goes to, there's usually a NATO mini-summit in the spring after a president is elected, and the heads of state and government come to NATO. They want to meet the new U.S. president. They just have one plenary, and then they have a press conference. And so this will happen now. My concern was that he might not show up for the summit. He might say, well, I'm going to send the vice president, J.D. Vance. I'm too busy to do a NATO thing. I'm hoping that's not the case, because really, I think for him to understand that the NATO he's dealing with today and the Europe he's dealing with today is different, is hearing from the Europeans. I don't think he's necessarily going to get this from his advisors. Not that they don't know it. I think the new Secretary of State certainly could, Marco Rubio, could lay out that NATO's different, but I'm not sure that's the mood of his advisors right now. They're not going to be lecturing him. That happened 4 years ago, or 8 years ago, and to a disaster. He would not listen to advisors. He wanted to be shown a big map or a chart and then move on to something else. And so I think while there is a lot that Trump needs to get up to speed on when it comes to NATO, when it comes to Europe, when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to dealing with Putin and Russia and where they are, he's not going to have some seminars put on by the National Security Council staff. They're not going to be, closed-door sessions with the Secretary of State or with the intel community, with the or with his national security advisor. They're having to get up to speed too, by the way. So I think his understanding of dealing with Europe is going to take some time for him to get his arms around how it's different. One thing you will hear that is going to be the same, because this is, if you will, this is Trump's safe harbor when it comes to Europe. If he has to say something, he talks about burden sharing. That's for the United States, both parties and presidents since, 1949, Truman and Eisenhower. We've always talked about burden sharing. That is an issue. We all acknowledge that. We know how difficult it is. We know that burden sharing is in a different place right now, as Europe realizes that it's got to be able to fill gaps that exist now, and that might get even worse under Trump. Certainly that is still an issue, but I think when we first hear Trump in public talk about Europe, he's going to talk about burden sharing, and Europe's got to do more, and they're freeloaders, et cetera. So we're going to hear that. What we might hear a couple years from now on that topic, he'll still talk about burden sharing, but it might be nuanced, because there has been a lot of change here, and that's a different Europe. And what NATO has been doing in terms of the war plans, in terms of all that NATO, the very good work NATO has done over the past 8 years, hopefully that will seep into his mind, and we'll get a more nuanced view of Europe. One area that we will probably not get a nuanced view of, and this is what he will probably focus on more than NATO, is the European Union. And I know I'm not supposed to talk about the EU, or at least that wasn't put on my agenda.
That's absolutely fine if you want to.
And you all probably aren't as interested as the EU as maybe if we were in Brussels. But he looks on the EU as the enemy, and I have not heard him change his view on that. And my understanding, too, is in Brussels, they're filling sandbags and they're digging ditches and putting up tank traps, knowing that they're going to have to deal with an assault from on tariffs and this type of thing from Trump. So we know that's going to happen. And so that's something that when you think about a Trump administration, Trump 2.0, within the first year, if he talks about Europe and NATO, it's going to be probably more about the European Union. and tariffs and what we're going to do. It won't be so much about NATO. I think we're just based on that one tweet, being a criminologist, I think we're going to be okay. I think we're going to be okay. We'll see how the Perm Rep does. As Max said, he doesn't know anything about Europe and NATO and foreign policy, defense policy. Maybe that's a good thing. Comes in with a fresh set of eyes. You know, we'll see. I'm looking for the silver lining here. I'm trying to be optimistic. I'm going to come down on being optimistic. So I think it's really going to be in looking at the EU. That's where the crosshairs are going to be for Trump in the early days. Last point would be this. Really, when you talk about Europe, the U.S., particularly Americans, we think of Europe as this monolith, you know, including the U.K., all in this big European thing. Well, it's not that. As we all know, every country is different. And so, you know, as he comes into power, he's going to look on some countries that he's had good relationships with in the past. Poland would be an example, UK, I think, as well. And I think there will be a bilateral relationship that's going to grow there as he pays attention to it. You know, he's not going to focus on the UK, for instance, when he wakes up in the morning every day. He'll focus on the UK or Norway or wherever it might be when there's a visit coming, when he has to come over to Europe for maybe a NATO meeting, who knows, when the Prime Minister comes to Washington. That's when he'll focus on the relationship, and it'll be a bilateral focus, and it'll be mainly a trade focus, and so that's when it's going to happen. And as I said, with Europe, there's some nations that are going to have that good bilateral relationship. Other nations, Orban in Hungary is another. Turkey, Erdogan. Other countries, it might be different. We'll have to see how he might get along with. We'll see about Macron. I mean, this is something where they started off as good friends and having parades, and I'm not sure quite how it's ended up, but we'll see how that happens. But it's going to be bilateral, and it's going to really take place when a forcing mechanism makes him focus on that particular country. So we'll just have to see. Final point, and I know that will still be a final point, but one more final point. And Max alluded to it, and we heard about that when we were talking about Ukraine. So much of European issues dealing with European security will be shaped by his personal relationship with Putin. He has talked quite a bit about it. It's important to him. I'm not sure how reciprocated it is. Putin they're going to use each other. They're going to maneuver each other. They're not going to be they're not going to let themselves be taken advantage of by the other. So there's going to be this bromance dance here. And that will impact, I think, a lot of how he's going to look on U.S. force posture in Europe. Max alluded to that. Maybe how he looks at NATO, certainly how he looks at Ukraine, is how he's going to triangulate, his relationship with Putin on what the issue is at hand. And we're going to see that in the first year of this term. As he deals with Ukraine, it'll be in the context of his relationship with Putin. So, as Max says, I don't know who the Russia person is on his staff, but I think if you have to point to someone being the Russia expert, it's Trump himself. He feels he knows more about Russia than anybody else. So we'll have to see how that relationship will shape and mold that relationship with the situation in Ukraine, with NATO, and with Europe as well. Thank you.
Jim, thank you very much, and it shows that the impact of Brexit, that I need to get an American to fly over to teach a British audience about what's happening just over in Brussels, and it's quite difficult, we find, sometimes on our project, because it's a trilateral between the UK, US and Norway, and sometimes we feel that there might be a little bit of a blind spot there with the EU, and it's very difficult because they change the acronyms every year, and it's been 8 years. So yeah, I'm still not quite there yet. Just the audience in the room before we go to Oana's intervention, as soon as Oana finishes, we'll go to Q&A, and then also to the people online. Again, use the Q&A function within Zoom and try and keep the questions short and sweet so we can get to as many as possible. So, Oana, over to you.
Thanks. So, like Jim, I'll try to be on the side of silver linings. I've been looking for silver linings, so, on this side of the panel. But yeah, just to reminisce a bit about the first Trump administration, we all remember that back in 2016, Donald Trump campaigned actually quite forcefully on NATO being obsolete. And by 2019, the London summit, I remember watching his briefing with Secretary General Stoltenberg, and he basically said it was just a few days after President Macron had said that NATO is brain dead, and Trump was asked about that, and he said that's a very rude comment. NATO serves a great cause. So there was, in a way, an arc between the campaign and the end of the first administration, and President Trump felt that he had fixed NATO, right? The money is pouring in. It's going like a rocket ship. You know, I'm just quoting some of the things he said about NATO at the time. And of course, to a certain extent, he did contribute to fixing NATO, to making NATO stronger. Right now, the majority of non-US allies are spending at least 2% of GDP on defense. That's 23 out of 32. It's a bigger alliance with the addition of Finland and Sweden, which of course are two very strong, capable allies. And we have the new defense plans, stronger cooperation with the Indo-Pacific, and a key role for NATO in supporting Ukraine. So I would be, of course, none of this is enough. And there's no guarantee of anything. And we can only predict the unpredictable. I don't think any of us actually know. But let me just outline, if you will, something like five tests for NATO looking ahead. The first one is that politics is personal, and politics is personnel. So I'm going to look at politics is personal, I'm going to look at money, Europe, Ukraine, and China. So in terms of politics is personal, the new Secretary General, like the previous Secretary General, has a good working relationship with Donald Trump. The former Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte describes himself as a friend of Donald Trump, and Donald Trump does the same. He said, we have become friends. He's somebody who is relaxed, who can also push back on Donald Trump, as we saw him when he was Prime Minister of the Netherlands. He was also among the first, actually, I think, after President Macron, to congratulate Donald Trump on his victory and to say that he's looking forward to advancing peace through strength through NATO. So he also spoke to Donald Trump, I think, the next day. So I would expect Mark Rutte to try to go to Washington as quickly as possible to meet not just the new administration, but also the new Congress. Very important, because of course the bipartisan support for NATO will be part of the calculus in terms of how the administration proceeds. And he will need to make the case, just like Jens Stoltenberg did, of why NATO is a good deal for the United States. Unlike Jim, don't think there's going to be a mini summit. I have difficulties in seeing President Trump coming to Europe several times in 1 year, and I've heard no discussion at NATO about that. What I can imagine is that the already planned NATO summit in The Hague in June will be much shorter than we could have expected. I don't think we're going to have, 4 or 5 sessions with lots of partners. I think it's going to be much, basically one session, perhaps with a much shorter statement. And perhaps we will not be seeing what we've seen recently, and that's helped drive the agenda forward, an annual NATO summit, at least for the foreseeable future. But anyway, that's just my hunch. But absolutely agree in terms of, politics is personal and politics is personnel, that the appointment, the nomination of Matt Whitaker as the next US Perm Rep is interesting in the sense that it's very quick. And it could be a positive sign, or it could be a sign that NATO is much more on the agenda than we may think it is. Actually, looking back at what Donald Trump said in his Truth Social post on the nomination. He said Matt Whitaker is a strong warrior and a loyal patriot. And I think loyalty, of course, is the key attribute to all his appointments so far, who will ensure US interests are advanced and defended, which is to be expected. Matt will strengthen relationships with our NATO allies rather than will keep NATO strong. I think there's a slight distinction because I think there will be a risk of bilateralization of a lot of relations and stand firm in the face of threats to peace and stability. He will put America first. I think the other appointment we need to watch will be the appointment of the next SACEUR, the next Supreme Allied Commander SACEUR, so the successor to General Cavoli, who of course has played an absolutely key role in setting up the new defense plans. Money, of course, I think money is absolutely key. Fair burden sharing, obviously, we're in a better place than we used to be, but is 2% enough? Does anybody here really think that 2% is enough, even if all European countries were on 2%, which they're not? Because if you look at the list, you know, you have some big Western European countries, and they know who they are, who are really not on 2% and have, very tenuous plans together, and neither is Canada. So I would think that there will be a big push towards 3%. And frankly, we should not need Donald Trump to tell us that we need 3%, because frankly, if there is any change or moderation of the US commitment to Europe, it's not going to be 3%. We will need 4% and 5% of GDP on defense. So I think we should be moving sooner rather than later towards investing at least 3% of GDP on defense. And interestingly, there's a new poll in Germany just the other day showing that 50% of those asked think that 3 to 3.5% is about right, which is a huge, huge mindset change for Germany. And of course, it's also about capabilities. And I think Mark Rutte has made a priority of both stressing the need to invest more, but also focusing on the capabilities that we need. And that's important. Which brings me to Europe. I agree that countries such as Poland, the UK, Turkey, in a way have an opportunity. They're perhaps best placed to establish even stronger relations with the next Trump administration, also in the interest of Europe and NATO. Hungary, of course, and Italy will also be in a strong position because they have close ties either to Donald Trump himself or to Elon Musk. So there will be some interesting dynamics there. My concern is that European governments right now are not politically very strong. If you look at Germany, if you look at France, you don't need to look very far to see that. But there may again be an opportunity in Germany, perhaps after the elections next February, with a new coalition, potentially with the CDU, CSU coming into power. I think that could be an interesting dynamic with potentially a Chancellor Friedrich Merz. In terms of the NATO-EU relationship, I think we do see a new dynamic there. There are new leaders in both organizations. Mark Rutte, of course, is a veteran of the European Council and to a certain extent is trusted much more by EU leaders than Jens Stoltenberg was, because Norway just isn't a part of the EU. And I think it's going to be interesting to see the relationship with Kaja Kallas as the new High Rep for Foreign Affairs and the first Defense Commissioner, Andrius Kubilius, both of them coming from Baltic states, so very focused on the importance and centrality of NATO in the defense of Europe, and therefore taking, I think, a much more pragmatic rather than ideological and sometimes which hasn't been so productive in the past. Now, Ukraine. I think it's important that at the very last minute, this is a last-ditch attempt to add a lot of the capabilities that are needed for Ukraine. It's late. We'll have to see what impact this will have. I think one contribution that the Europeans can make, which is not in the hands of NATO, is using the frozen Russian funds for Ukraine. I think that would help Ukraine have a more secure future. And of course, another country, Belgium, which is in political turmoil and hasn't got a government, also plays a role in there. But I think there are things that can and should be done before the inauguration. And I think we don't have a lot of time to do that. The other thing that I think the Europeans should be seriously considering within NATO is that in any ceasefire, peace deal, whatever it turns out to be, the prospect of NATO membership for Ukraine should not be taken off the table. Because if it is in any way, then of course it will be a victory for Putin. It will be back to the so-called draft security treaties that he put forward to both NATO and the US in December 21, which basically would have taken Europe back to 97, back to the enlargement of NATO and the EU. And of course, we know that it requires political consensus among all the allies. So frankly, if the US, for instance, doesn't want NATO membership for Ukraine next year, they don't need to put it into a treaty with Russia. It has to be a sovereign decision rather than part of the peace deal with Russia. And that brings me to China, which is the final but I think important point, because we know that is the focus of the new administration, as basically it's been as previous administrations. And I just think that we need to make the point much more clearly, and I don't know why maybe people in Washington don't want to listen, but to make the connection between the Euro-Atlantic theater and the Indo-Pacific theater. And the arrival of over 10,000 North Korean troops on the front lines obviously makes that point very clearly. But just to make the point that a deal on Putin's terms over Ukraine would be a sign of weakness, not of strength, and it would only embolden not just Russia, but also China, North Korea, and Iran.
Well, thank you very much. Question time, grilling the audience, which from sitting in the middle, I feel far more optimism on my left and a little bit more pessimism on my right. So we'll go to the audience in the room first. So please catch my eye, put your hand up, and please wait for a microphone for the benefit of the people who are online. So gentleman in the center, and then the lady just behind as well, please.
Thanks very much. All really useful comments. I'm Jonathan Leader-Maynard from the International Affairs Unit of the House of Commons. Two quick questions. Since the election result, I've heard the word transactional in podcasts and writings over and over again to describe Trump. Is there a deal that European leaders can offer him in order to strengthen the support he might give to European security? We had some mention of maybe going up to 3% targets or something like that. Do you think there's a transactional way of approaching that? Also, would anyone like to comment at all on the possible linkage between US domestic politics and US foreign policy towards Europe? Maybe there isn't one, but I think I would share the view that there's a risk that this administration will be very chaotic domestically. Might that create incentives for greater nationalism? We often make that link, that you use foreign policy as a distraction from domestic turmoil. Thanks.
The lady just behind.
Thank you. Anna Matvieva, King's College London. In a way, Trump's withdrawal from European security, to some extent, would can be argued, leaves a space for European actors to act really gives them an opportunity. So we might not look at it as a doomsday. We might look at it as an opportunity for Europeans to really kind of show what they can. So my question, what European actors can do in the light of scaling down of the US role, what can they offer to Russia, for example, to Ukraine, apart from stone shadows, and not only in terms of capabilities, but also perhaps in terms of diplomacy. Thank you.
Okay, so transactional, first one, I think US domestic politics potentially taken by Max, and then finally, which is actually a question that we're getting a lot online, is about Europeans acting. What can they tangibly do at this present moment? So Max, do you want to start on domestic politics?
Well, maybe I'll start on the transactional point. So this is why I'm very skeptical that there's like a deal. And the reason why is because theoretically it should very much be possible, right? In the US system, everything is sort of linked and coordinated inside of the National Security Council. There's interagency policy meetings, and we can link the kind of security side and all the economic, climate, tech questions that are going to come up in fights with the European Union. So why I'm skeptical of it is that I think what's going to happen is that the national security officials that are going to be appointed are going, and this is why I'm sort of, I think we're in for a new day, is because it's not just about Trump. Trump's going to pay very little attention to NATO and European security. The issue is that the people appointed are going to go in with an idea of trying to change things and shift the balance of responsibility to Europeans. So that is going to be pushed on the security side. Meanwhile, there's going to be chaotic negotiations and fights with the EU on a number of things. There's going to be collisions and collisions and collisions. Tech policy. Don't even think about going after Elon Musk, or else European security is going to be at risk. Tariffs, don't even think about doing tariffs. European security is going to be at risk. Meanwhile, we're pulling back from European security. So I just think we're going to be pushing on all these fronts. And so if you're trying to make a cross-sector deal with Lighthizer or on tech policy, I just think our system is not going to match. And also, how does Europe make a deal? The EU is empowered to act in response to tariffs. By law, they have to take action on the social media space that is going to come into conflict. They have to do CBAM. So all these things on climate and are going to lead to conflict. And so I just don't see either how the US is going to make some big grand deal and how Europe is postured to make that deal. Maybe quickly on domestic politics. Look, one of the big changes, and so this is sort of a little bit separate from your question, is that the United States has much less attachment to Europe than we used to. When you think about the use of the term white people in US discourse, it's really come of age the last generation. But if you watch a movie like Karate Kid from the 1980s, right, it was Daniel LaRusso, who was of Italian descent, and this white Anglo-Saxon Protestant with blonde hair is the bad guy, and that you wouldn't have said they're both white people back in the 1980s. And partly there was a reflection of Italian, Irish, all these different European differences were part of American culture, and that has all sort of been blended away. And so the attachment to Europe in general, the understanding of Europe in general has really faded over the last generation. American officials don't really understand Europe very well. We are focused on post 9/11 on a war on terror. We could tell you a lot about the ethnic breakdown of Iraq and now about China, but how the European Council and European Commission work, that is there's a few people in Washington that do that, and maybe they're focused on tech policy or a specific thing. So I think domestically, we have this less attachment to Europe. And then when it comes to will he use foreign policy as a distraction from what's going on, perhaps on the one hand, Americans don't really want to engage that much in the world right now. We were at war for 20 years. That created a sense of exhaustion, added to the sense of isolationism and American first mentality. And so I don't think, in some ways, there's a non-interventionist streak, which is not great for Ukraine. But in some ways, Trump is very much about keeping America actually out of wars. And so I don't really see that sort of triggering as some sort of distraction. Maybe just finally, I'm going on too long. But yes, Europe can do a lot. And so this sense of European helplessness, I think, is just utterly misplaced. Europe is wealthy. 450 million people inside the European Union can take action to begin to address the gaps that could be left by the United States to help Ukraine. A lot more can be done. And in fact, the fact that the United States is there means Europeans are like, well, if Americans aren't doing it, then we don't have to. I think is a mentality that will have to change over the next 4 years.
I think, could you just follow on from Max's point there? Because I think it would be very interesting hearing from a Ukrainian perspective of what you think Europe should be doing as well, considering you have the direct experience of fighting a large-scale war, which the Europeans don't.
Yeah, I do completely agree that the main problem, I was actually willing to make a follow-up comment on that. From Ukrainian perspective, the main problem of our European partners is lack of political leadership or willingness to be politically ahead of all the support of Ukraine and ahead of strategy towards Russia. And it's not mainly about the US being a main military donor to Ukraine, but rather US being for 2.5 or more, almost 3 years already, like a leader of this pro-Ukrainian coalition in this war. And I think that's the main problem, that's the main obstacle. Even now, when I speak to colleagues who are working on the continent, they always insist that, if there is a problem with establishing a good, fruitful cooperation on defense and security issues in Europe with Trump administration, we need UK back, we need UK in. What for do you need UK exactly? For political leadership, not for defense industry of UK. Rather for somebody to govern all this bunch of countries, supposedly with the same approach, different one, but the same approach that Ukraine should survive and should sustain. But at the same time, there is a refrain from being, very visible. I think Germany is a good example of a country who was investing, at least until recently, a lot in comparison to what was expected from Germany. But at the same time, the political strategy within this pro-Ukrainian coalition for Germany was to stay in the shadow of political leadership of US, UK, even France, not to be considered neither by Russia nor by someone else as the great and huge supporter of Ukraine on a financial or military level. One more comment here about what else European actors can do. I think from Ukrainian perspective, there is a clear understanding right now that there are serious, they are not catastrophic, but there are divisions, and they will sustain for some time. The divisions from security perspective, which countries are willing to do what, and what are horizon of possible cooperation with specific countries. Though Ukraine has signed almost 30 security agreements with different countries supporting Ukraine, and in most cases these agreements are very similar one to another except for some specific details or non-public parts, but generally, still there is an understanding that despite the formal level of having the same security or similar security agreements with all those countries, there is a division between those who have the same approach towards Russia and towards supporting Ukraine, and those who have more modest, let's say, approach. From this point of view, UK, Poland, even Baltic states which do not possess any defense capabilities comparable to those Ukraine can, work on with UK or with Poland, but still Nordic countries, Finland, even Sweden here is a good place. So Ukraine, from its perspective, in my opinion, in the next 4 years, while Trump is in Washington, regardless of what Trump exactly will be doing, Ukraine will be doubling down on deepening relations with those countries where we see the perspective of being as close on security and defense terms as possible. And this is what we are observing now. However, of course, the position of US will influence and impact, and especially under Trump, these perspectives of this cooperation. I do think that the good example of how Washington impacts this is the air defense shield, the idea which Ukraine is trying to set up with at least Poland and Romania to persuade them to start shut down the air targets above Ukraine, at least above the critical infrastructure objects in the very west of Ukraine, and to prevent at least that part of Ukraine from being on a nightly and daily basis targeted by missiles and drones. But again, we do have more or less perspective position of Poland here, more accurate and more concerned approach on the side of Romania here, but we haven't had any political confirmation or even silent approval from US yet. And probably from this point of view, Warsaw and Washington relations under Trump will be more or less a new chance to go forward with this idea for Ukraine.
Thank you. And as I just throw those questions over to this side, I was wondering if you could sort of make specific reference within NATO and Europe to sort of the different requirements of, obviously, there's a leadership aspect of this, there's a cultural aspect of this. When you're looking at capabilities, there's combat capabilities, and then there's enablers. The issue within Europe is that the Americans spend lots of money on very critical enablers. So actually, if the enablers get moved out of Europe, then Europe has to spend a lot of money on very expensive equipment. And I remember when I was at NATO, I mean, in 2014, it was really US leadership after the Crimea operation that started to drive shape, particularly in. And then I think while I'm here, just to blend with something online, because from Edmund Gold, because I didn't mention yesterday, this morning, within terms of Jim's bio, but you were actually responsible for the special relationship. There's a question that is particularly pertinent for Jim, which is, do you think that Keir Starmer will be able to navigate his way with a special relationship with Trump on the one hand and the EU on the other, particularly if the EU-US relationship frays over tariffs, say to Ukraine or something else? So do you want to start with that, Jim, and then we'll move on to Oana?
Well, thank you for handing me a bomb to start off with. On the special relationship, as I've said last night over dinner and other places as well, the special relationship between the U.S. and the UK, it's a real thing. It can ebb and flow depending on personalities and the situations at hand. But in my many years in the Pentagon, working in Europe and NATO, I watched that in action. And the special relationship is something that has primarily a kind of a defense and military focus than anything else. The SDR that the UK military is going through right now, that's something that the U.S. is privileged to take a look at after a lot of the work is done, and we give a view. Other countries are too. It's not necessarily just the U.S., but I think our two militaries are integrated in a very large degree, and it's something that works very well for us and for you. It's something that we get along and work very well together. I think that in terms of Keir Starmer and the EU and with Trump himself and how will that look, it goes back to something that was said earlier. Trump is transactional. And I don't think he's going to look on Keir Starmer as someone from Labour or what his relationship with the EU is and what he might have said over here. I think he's going to look at the special relationship in terms of trade. He's going to look at the special relationship in terms of not so much because he's not a military defense guy, because he's all about, so what do I get out of this? That's his approach. When we say he's transactional, that's what it means. He tries to figure out, so what do I get? If I give the UK this, what do we get? How can I get to where I want to go with Europe or with the UK? What do I need to do to get the UK to move in my direction? That's what he's doing. And so I think because he's transactional, not ideological, or he doesn't have a political bone to pick with Keir Starmer or with Labour, I think the sitting government here is going to do okay as long as you come in as transactional too. You need to be transactional, and I think that's something he appreciates. That he can deal with that. If you come in strong and you come in and say, well, these are things that we need, and you work the deal, I think he's probably more familiar with that kind of give and take than someone who comes in and is weak and begs for something, or who comes in and is dismissive. He'd rather sit across the table and work a deal. And if Labor can do that, if you all can go forward with that, I think it should be okay. The SDSR that I mentioned, there's a lot of us who are looking very carefully at that. And again, as I said, he's probably not looking at that, but I think his Secretary of Defense probably would, our military certainly would, and it's something that we look on as important as a bellwether for leadership in Europe in terms of military and defense things. The European militaries look at what the UK does. You might not be in the EU, but that doesn't matter in this case. You're in NATO. And what the UK military does is important. And it's important to us, too, because we like to if we're in a fight, we want to be in a fight with you all. Well, not with you, but with us together. When we were fighting the Houthis, as we still are, the fact that British aircraft flew out of Akatiri and participated in that meant a lot for us. I think we would have wanted 2 squadrons to fly out of Akatiri and not just a couple of airplanes. I think to me, it's the mass of the UK military that we want to see increased, because it takes a lot to take part in these operations. And it's a stretch for you all because of the size. And so I won't get into the SDR, but that's why it's important to us, and that's why we're going to be working with you all to see where you want to go. But at the end of the day, it's up to you, obviously. You've got national health issues, and I mean, both of our governments have other places where we want to put our defense money. And so you've got to figure that out, as we have to figure it out too. But that's why when we're doing things together, we're better able to operate because we can gain strength by that special relationship as it pertains to the military side.
Slightly concerned that there will be a contagion effect. I think Max alluded to that, between the tariffs that President Trump is likely to impose perhaps on day one, 10 to 20% on everybody else and up to 60% on China. And that, of course, will lead to tit-for-tat response from the European Union, certainly because they've already been preparing and have lists of things that America would notice. So I think that will have an impact, risks having an impact on relations within the NATO alliance as well. And we know very well, as Jim was saying, if we look back at the first Trump administration, Donald Trump was really upset about German cars, right? And, that's still an issue. So I think trade surpluses and specific things that he's aware of, he will be looking at that. So we need to have a look. And the other thing that he was really upset about, and for good reason, was Nord Stream 2 and gas imports from Russia. And it's interesting that the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, floated recently the idea that the EU could buy more LNG from the US. So I think there will be a lot of discussion on energy. Of course, Donald Trump repeats the mantra, drill, baby, drill. And that will have an impact both in relations with Europe, but may also bring down the price of oil and gas for Russia, which could have an impact on the war in Ukraine. But what can the Europeans do? Well, the Europeans, need to show more leadership, need to stop wasting time, because it's not like we didn't know that there was a war in Europe 3 years ago and actually back in 2014. And we have been losing too much time. And I think investing in the defense industrial base, both Europeans, but also transatlantic. I think there is an idea that, oh, we just need to buy European, produce European, and then we'll be fine. We know that it's all deeply interrelated in the defense industry, so I think also investing in what brings us together as Europe and North America in terms of defense capabilities, but doing it really faster and at mass. Yeah. That's what Europeans should have done years ago.
In the interest of time, we'll take 2 more questions from the audience. We've first got Carsten down here, and then the lady in the middle, and then I've tried to blend a couple of questions from online. So Carsten first.
Thank you. I'm Carsten Friis from NUPI Oslo, Norway. To Mariia first, well, let me first express my sympathy and admiration for your more than 1,000 days of fighting. It's impressive. You said wisely, I think, that what we should do is investing in Ukrainian defense industry. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that, because investing in drone production, you can scale up quickly, but there are lots of other, building up factories from scratch take years, and we don't have years, I think. So maybe just elaborate a little bit on that. And to Jim, if U.S. funding dries up, so to speak, is anything legally, practically preventing Europeans from just buying all the American stuff and give it to Ukraine?
The lady at the back in the middle.
Thank you. Ellie Cook from Newsweek. We've seen Ukraine say this morning that they have recorded the first use of an intercontinental ballistic missile in the conflict. Conflicting assessments coming out on that. Firstly, do you believe this assessment? And do you think the timing is a coincidence? Thank you.
Thank you. Given time, I think Mariia, if you could talk about investing in Ukrainian domestic production, we'll then move to Jim to the US funding and the ICBMs, given your experience, and then I'll give a final 2 minutes to Oana and Matt.
Mm-hmm. Just a couple of words, what can be said, because there was already some public information about that. In case Ukraine doesn't have sufficient number of longer-range missiles, or doesn't have a permission, in case the permission is abandoned, the recent one, to strike deep inside Russia, I think no one in the area of defense and security has any doubts now that Ukraine will strike with its own missiles, which will be produced soon in needed quantities. So this production track is one of the priorities. And in contrast to the missiles which are produced like Storm Shadows here or Atakams, so they can be produced locally. So here, this is a clear role of our partners who can really invest rather than produce or co-produce with Ukraine. And drones, of course, yes, not only those who should be used by mechanized brigades to support them or who can be used by land forces, sea drones, which Ukraine will need 4 years to come to secure at least that narrow route, which we succeeded in with support of UK in particular, to reopen the sea export again. But the problem with drones right now, I think that production, even local production, is in many cases supported by local investors. And those drones which are produced or sent to Ukraine as ready items from outside of the country, sometimes they are not that kind of efficient as those locally produced. So again, I'm just trying to make clear the link between where our partners can be, rather than investing in production on their territories and send the ready weapons like drones to Ukraine, just compare, this is for production guys to assess, to compare the level of efficiency of the ready drones sent to Ukraine as part of military aid and to those produced in Ukraine by local producers, and rather probably it's easier to invest locally, just give money locally, because sometimes it's really reasonable, and this is proved by the efficiency on the ground. And the last but not least here is just not about the type of the weapons, but basically I do feel that when it comes to role of technologies and drones in particular, there is a doubt among our partners that we still have to double down on that. But situation on the battlefield, though I'm not a purely military expert, the situation on the battlefield proves that Russia is prevailing here with using that simple technology where Ukraine prevailed 2 years ago. So Russia is learning how to invest, they are updating their drones, and they are prevailing over other tactics. Ukraine, especially land forces, are trying to implement right now on the front line. So I do think we are, I don't know why, but even our partners, we are underestimating right now, again, the role of those technologies, while we should invest more, in particular locally.
Jim, quickly, can Europeans buy American and ICBMs?
So I think Norwegian F-16s were transferred to Ukraine, right? So that's an example of how it can be done, because those F-16s were bought by Norway from the United States back in the day and flown very well. But the thing is, we have this third country transfer. A lot of countries do this who manufacture arms. Before a buyer wants to transfer it to a third party, he has to get approval from the source that manufactured it. So there are steps that have to be taken. In the case of Norway, we took those steps to approve that Norwegian third country transfer to Ukraine. But we have to do it bureaucratically in the United States to make sure that it meets all the legal and other aspects that come with a country transferring what it bought from the U.S. to a third party. So yes, the bottom line, it can be done, but you got to go through hurdles to make that kind of thing happen. But I think there's a bigger issue there too, which is, and it goes back to what Oana said, is that investment in European defense as well, in cooperation. I mean, transatlantic defense trade is one of the most emotional and complicated things. But I think coming and buying stuff from us in the short term and doing a third country transfer, that's great, because we don't have a lot of time to rebuild a European or transatlantic defense industry. But at the end of the day, for the long term, we've got to do that so that there's not this dependency on the United States in a lot of different ways that has built up over time. On ICBMs, I saw that too, and I'm not surprised that they would use that. It's a conventional warhead was on it, wasn't a nuclear, but it's a step up in terms of the delivery vehicle, which is a signal in and of itself. Why is it being done now? I think the Russians are doing a lot of things right now, working with the Chinese on those cables. I guess we'll have to find out there. The huge strikes on Ukrainian cities. There's a lot of things that Putin's doing right now to express his displeasure over ATACMS, I'm sure, but also to message to the incoming administration, don't think that we're close friends with you guys and you're going to roll over us, Trump. We're not happy with the United States. We're not happy with the West. We're not happy with what you're doing, and you're going to see our fist about this. So I think to me, I think this is a bit of messaging going on to us, which is you better know that things are different today than they were 4 years ago when you left.
Oana, final 60 seconds from you.
Yeah, just a general message that yes, I think the next 4 years will be turbulent, will be complicated, but and there may be many things that we don't like, that the Americans don't like about Europeans and Europeans don't like about Americans in general. But ultimately, if you look at the growing alignment between Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, these authoritarian states, which are all adversaries to what the US stands for and to what Europeans stand for, it's in our interest to stay calm, to plan and to invest in what unites us rather than in what divides us. Because otherwise, the stakes will be very high.
Yeah, and to do it quickly.
And I think I'll give the last 30 seconds to Max as the ranking member from the CSIS, but also it means that you can't talk to us about EU Eurobonds.
Yes, no,
seconds.
I cannot.
So, closing.
What I would say, Ed, thanks so much for having us and organizing, and it's been great to partner with you and with NUPI. Is that this is, to paraphrase Mario Draghi, I think Europe needs to do whatever it takes. And so when it comes to supporting Ukraine, it means investing in Europe. It means if you need to go buy American 155 production and then give that to Ukraine, do that. And so this is, if it means investing in Ukrainian defense industry, and Europe has the resources to it doesn't have to pick and choose. It can do all of that. And I think it really needs that spirit of whatever it takes to preserve Ukrainian democracy, and by preserving Ukrainian democracy, European security. And that really has to be, I think, the driving function for European leaders over the next 4 years.
That's great closing remarks, so it just remains for me to say thank you very much to the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs for supporting this project, also from colleagues at NUPI and CSIS for travelling, and then also the panel, thank you very much, especially to Jim and Oana, who actually changed their travel plans to make it today. And very final point, we're going to continue some of these conversations on the 9th of December here for a paper launch on the Joint Expeditionary Force and its contribution to European security, which is under this programme. You can see it on the website and sign up as you did today. So just a round of applause to thank the panel. Thank you.